seems not. So we will be handing you over then to Professor Arnold Smit. He is professor at the USB, well known in the ethics sector and for social impact, and he was also the recent previous head of the social impact division at USB. Professor Smit, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you, Christelle. Thank you, Christelle. From my side, welcome everybody. It is great to share the evening with you. My thoughts go back to last year at the beginning of April when I presented also at an alumni event in Durban. And there we were in a small room with about 20 people. The difference was that there were lovely snacks and a glass of wine. Tonight it's very different. The snacks are not there. There's not a light supper that we can enjoy together. There is no wine, no wine for more than one reason. But we have lots of people that can share in the event. And also I have noticed already some of our alumni and some very good friends, and welcome from my side. The theme that I'm going to deal with tonight, dealing with grief and loss at work, is a theme that made me think lately, and a theme that I also in other occasions have made some contributions to. And what I would like to focus on in this event tonight are three things around this particular theme. The one is loss in itself. What is the kind of loss that we are talking about here, specifically in relation to where we find ourselves at the moment in society? The second would be to come to a better understanding of grief, how we experience it, what are we talking about, why grief specifically in relation to grief at work. And then the last part would be around leadership, because I work on the assumption that many of those on the call or with us in the webinar are people who take responsibility for others and for their well-being. And therefore, we would like to link it to leadership as well. There will be three polls that I will announce as we go, and the polls will all offer you an opportunity to share your own particular experiences in relation to these three themes. So, a while ago, somebody introduced me to this poem written by Warsan Shire. She lives in the UK, she has grown up in Africa, and at a particular time she was literally thinking about what's happening in the world around her. One night, sitting with an atlas on her lap, and asked the question whilst her finger was running across the pages, asking the question, so where does it hurt? And then the answer that she gave was, everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. So where does it hurt? Literally everywhere. So from what we experience, I think at the moment, in the Corona context in which we find ourselves, I think it's for many of us quite natural to be able to associate us with the words of this poem. Specifically in relation to the losses that we are experiencing at the moment. But then in the sense that the losses are not so much identifiable always per event or per a something or in terms of a person, and I will talk a little bit about that later, but we are surrounded with an all-pervasive context of hurt in a variety of forms. And the kind of loss that I then would like to focus on, or the kind of hurt that I would like to focus on, is specifically that hurt that connects with loss and the losses that we might be experiencing from a market and a workplace perspective. So here is a poll that I would like you to respond to. A poll just with one question. So Lizelle, if you can bring up the poll for us, it will be good. And this is an invitation for everybody to make your choice in terms of the poll. So if you can click on your choice, Lizelle, it's question 1, it's the right one. Did you suffer any form of loss as a result of the corona pandemic? Yes or no? And then the second question, did anybody that you are related to, work or do business with, suffer any form of loss as a result of the corona pandemic? We're going to give a minute or so that you can respond to it. Suffering a personal direct loss, vis-a-vis in the second question, knowing somebody that you are related to, work with or do business with that might have suffered loss during this time. So we have about 40 responses at the moment. We are waiting for another 25 or so. All right, so we're just above 40. So there's another 10 or so people, 10 to 15 people. If you want to respond, you're most welcome. Great, we are closing in on 50. Going to count down to 10. And I'm going to share. So we end the poll now, and let's share the results. Quite interesting, ladies and gents, if we look at the results in front of us, there's almost an even split between whether we have suffered from a personal perspective any particular loss, but then almost all of us have some connection with somebody that suffered some kind of loss at this time. And I think it just illustrates to us how pervasive it has become, that many people in society are somehow connected to somebody that might have been negatively affected and have suffered a form of loss at this time. So the results have been shared. There we are. We stop the sharing and we continue. So when we look at the areas of impact, the interest that we have in the topic is not so much to debate the relationship between the presence of the pandemic on the one hand, and on the other hand, the restrictions or the legal arrangements to contain the pandemic. That's not the focus of tonight. We would like to hear once again later on from the President speaking to these matters. But what we would like to work with is the reality as it is, and ask questions about the impact of the pandemic on industries and jobs and people in order to profile the kind of losses that we are talking about here. So what is interesting, if we do some background research around this, that there seem to be certain focal industries that seem to be particularly hard hit by the pandemic. It's not that they are necessarily more important than any of the other industries, but it is so that they come up specifically in the news, they come up in articles, they come up in the statistics, and these are the industries well known to us, and many of you in the webinar, you might have already experienced this. You might be working in these industries. There are certain job types that seem to be particularly hard hit. Now, we've already received the news that we might have an estimated 3 million people who might be affected from an unemployment perspective. But what we have in front of us is not unemployment per se. What we have in front of us in terms of these numbers is the decline in job advertisements in terms of these particular jobs. So the demand for these jobs have dropped in terms of Adzuna, the statistics that Adzuna came up with. This is the factor by which the demand has dropped in these particular jobs that we see here. And I've just taken the top 60%, but we can already see the profiling around these jobs. Jobs that are much more at the forefront, jobs that are much more in a kind of a manual space, domestic and cleaning, property workers, admin, hospitality and catering, retail, and so forth. Of course, senior levels are also affected by it, but we've got a good indication here of where the pain sits at the moment in terms of the decline in demand and the scarcity of vacancies. I think it's also appropriate that we highlight specific categories. People that are particularly hard hit by this, such as, for instance, informal traders, people who are dependent upon walk-by customers, who are dependent upon marketplace concentrations, a market stand somewhere, and they're not able to do what they've been used to. SMEs who are dependent upon vibrant, working and efficient supply chains, and then as the pandemic has rolled out and developed over time, we more and more became aware of the impact that the pandemic has on women, and specifically women-led businesses. Apart from the fact that women have an uphill battle in many areas in the working environment, at the same time, the pandemic and the impact of that has pulled them back into the domestic space where care for children, care for households have become, for many of them, the overarching occupation of this current time in which we find ourselves in. So they are particularly hard hit as a result of this. I was talking to an alumnus student from Stellenbosch Business School this afternoon, and I was just kind of in a joking manner said to her, "So the pandemic swallowed you over the last few months?" And she said, "Well, I had to spend so much time in terms of the education of my children over the last 3 months. Luckily, they were able to go back to school now. So time has been freed up again, also for her." The point that I would like to make about this is to focus our attention on the types of losses that emerge from these areas of impact. Some of these losses we can count as much more tangible. So loss of jobs, losses of income. Income also might include budget and projections for the year ahead that have not been realized since the pandemic started and the lockdown was imposed. Loss in terms of business and turnover. Loss in terms of security in the sense of food security or shelter or normal safety. This is kind of tangible, but there are other types of losses that are much more existential. The loss of freedom, freedom of movement, the loss of community and socialization and that sense of connectivity to other people. We can also speak about the loss of health, both from a physical as well as maybe from a mental and psychological perspective. We can talk about the loss of life, the real loss that comes about in a context of bereavement. We've become used to Zoom-based commemorations lately. Our own family has been affected by that. Also loss in terms of normalcy. Things are, in a sense, being turned on their heads. And then also loss of meaning. These much more existential expressions. So one would be able to say that every industry and every business and every job means more than just money in the bank and food on the table, because it constitutes for us a web of connectedness, a web of opportunity. It constitutes for us meaning. So all of these losses contribute to this all-pervasive sense that life as we have known it until now, it seems to be unraveling around us. And things will never be the same again. So what will be and how it will be is not yet known to us. And we know that we will almost have to rebuild a new and a different society. And together with that then comes, on the one hand, that sense of expectation. It's almost an excitement about what it could be, but also a sense of anxiety because we don't have a clear idea as yet in terms of what will survive the current context and where will it take us to. So now we can ask another question, and that question is, what does this feel like? Now that we have got a bit of a profile in terms of what we speak of, what does it feel like? So in the Harvard Business Review of the 23rd of March this year, Scott Berinatu was in a virtual room together with a few colleagues, and also then in conversation with David Kessler, a global expert on grief. And the meeting was called, and the conversation with Kessler was called because the staff would, at that point in time, they wanted to create new content that could be helpful for people in this particular context of loss and grief. And then it didn't take long for them to realize that they are not only just talking about what is happening in society around them, they're also talking about the grief and loss that they were suffering themselves. And hence the topic that came out in terms of the eventual publication, the article in the Harvard Business Review, that discomfort you're feeling is grief. So there's a second poll that I would like Lizelle to put up for us. Lizelle, can you put up that second poll for us? So here are 5 emotions. And the question is, which of these emotions have you lately experienced? And you can mark as many as you find relevant, but concentrate on those that you had the most acute experience of. First one, COVID-19 is not such a big deal. Who the heck brought the virus in? Just lift the restrictions. We know how to behave. No more, please. Enough is enough. We'd better become used to this. And there's a final one. There is hope. So which of these experiences did you have lately? And mark those 1 or 2 that might have been more prevalent than the others. So I'm going to give a few seconds more. Good. So I'm going to end the poll. I think we have a pattern that we can work with. And let's have a look at the results. Well, it's quite interesting if we look at that. It seemed to be that not such a big deal is a small one. Who the heck brought it in is not such a small, it's a small one. Just lift the restrictions, it's a smaller one. A bit more prominent, we'd better become used to this. Sorry, no more please, enough is enough. And then number 5, we'd better become used to this. Seems to be the most prevalent one. And then there is one at the end, which is also more on the bolder side. There is hope. Probably if we were talking about this at the beginning of the pandemic, we might have seen that the emphasis might have been elsewhere in terms of what we would have said then. And I will give you a particular interpretation of that as we continue. Oh, there my screen share has gone. So let us just restore that. So let's talk about the nature of grief and loss. So the study of grief and loss is a field of expertise on its own, and it's not my intention tonight that we overstep on the areas of the real experts in this regard, but to see what we can know and how we can apply this for our own sake and in terms of the focus that we would like to create for our being together here. Specifically, I would also like to add that we all know grief that comes